The Valerin Institute was not a beautiful place, not in the way people usually meant when they used that word. It was a station, a large one, yes, but still just metal and glass and recycled air, hanging in the dark between three star systems like a coin someone had dropped and forgotten about. It did not sparkle. It did not hum with the kind of energy that made you feel important just by standing inside it. It was cold in the mornings and loud in the hallways, and the food in the lower cafeteria was bad in a way that crossed species lines, because every student from every world seemed to agree, at least on that one thing. But it was the best academic station in the coalition, and everyone who was sent there knew it. Claire Dutton had lived on the station for 11 years. She had arrived at 34 with 2 bags, a data drive full of lecture notes, and a quiet confidence that the people who ran the institute had not fully understood when they hired her. They had read her credentials. They had seen her degrees, her publications, her years of teaching back on Earth. They had thought they were hiring a history teacher. They were not wrong, exactly, but they were not entirely right either. She was 45 now. Her hair had more gray in it than it used to. She wore the same style of plain dark jacket almost every day. She did not decorate her classroom. She did not put up motivational phrases on the walls or arrange the seats in a circle to make students feel like they were equals. The seats were in rows. The display screen was at the front. She stood near it when she talked, and she walked between the rows when she wanted students to feel like she could appear next to them at any moment, which she could. Her course was called Strategic History and Applied Civilizational Theory. It was a required course for all third-year students at the Institute, regardless of species. This fact alone was enough to make most students dislike it before it began. Required courses were, in the experience of most young people across the galaxy, things you survived rather than things you learned from. On the first morning of the new semester, 23 students filed into room 14C on the Institute's academic ring. They came from 9 different species. They carried different kinds of writing tools, different kinds of tablets, different kinds of bodies. Some were tall. Some had more arms than a human would consider standard. Some communicated in ways that required small translation devices clipped near their ears or beside their breathing organs. But they all had one thing in common on that first morning. None of them wanted to be there. The Varath students arrived first, as they always did. There were 4 of them. They were tall, with pale gray skin and 6 arms, and they moved with the slow, deliberate ease of people who have never once in their lives been rushed by anything. The Varath civilization was over 11,000 years old. They had libraries that predated human agriculture. They had political systems older than most species-written languages. They sat in the back row, arranged their materials with quiet precision. Basan looked at the rest of the room the way an adult looks at a children's birthday party, with patience and very little interest. The Dasani came in next, 3 of them, and they were louder, not in volume, but in presence. The Dasani were a race of conquerors, or they had been once. Their empire had broken 4 other civilizations across 2 centuries before a series of internal collapses had forced them into the coalition as members rather than masters. They were sharp-featured, quick-eyed, and they communicated between themselves in a layered harmonic hum that sounded to human ears a little like music being played backwards. They found seats in the middle section and immediately began humming to each other in what was clearly a private conversation. The other students filtered in after that. 2 Valesi, whose bodies were almost entirely bioluminescent, and who communicated primarily through color shifts in their skin. A pair of Gren, heavy and slow-moving, from a low-gravity world that most other species found unremarkable. A handful of others, representing species with long names that most humans mispronounced for months before getting right. And then, near the front, 3 humans. Kevin Marsh was one of them. He was 22 years old from a small town in Ohio, and he had the look of someone who had worked hard to get somewhere and was still slightly surprised that he had made it. He had short brown hair and a round, open face, and he sat with his tablet already open and a stylus already in his hand, which said something about him right away. The other two human students were a woman named Diane Cole, who had grown up in a military family and carried herself like it, and a young man named Pete Garrow, who had transferred from a university on Mars and who spent the first 5 minutes of class looking out the small window at the gas giant below them, like he still could not believe he was here. Claire walked in at exactly the scheduled time. She did not rush. She did not greet the class with warmth or with theater. She set her tablet on the small ledge near the display screen, looked out at the room for a moment, and then turned to the screen and brought up a single line of text. It read, "Why every dominant civilization in recorded history believed it had already won." She let them read it. She did not explain it. She stood with her hands at her sides and watched their faces, and their faces were interesting. The Varath students read it and showed nothing. The Dosani students read it, and one of them shifted slightly in her seat. The Gren exchanged a slow glance. Kevin Marsh read it and tilted his head a little, like a dog hearing an unfamiliar sound. Then Claire spoke. She said that this course was not about dates. It was not about battles or treaties, or the names of leaders who had risen and fallen across the centuries. Those things would come up, because they always did. But they were not the point. The point, she said, was to understand something that almost no civilization had ever managed to understand about itself, while it was still alive and powerful enough for the understanding to matter. She said that almost every species in coalition history at the height of its power had believed it had solved the problem of its own future, had believed with total confidence that it understood the shape of what was coming, and had organized its laws and its armies and its culture around that belief. And almost every one of those civilizations had been wrong, in ways that their own historians had later described as obvious. She paused. She asked the class, "What does it feel like to be obvious in hindsight?" Nobody answered. The room was very quiet. Even the Dosani had stopped humming. She nodded, as if the silence itself was the correct response. Then she said, "Good. Hold that feeling. We are going to spend a semester with it." Somewhere near the back, a pen moved. Then another. Then, one by one, across all 9 species and all 23 students, writing began. Claire turned back to the screen. She did not smile. She had done this 11 times before. She already knew how it ended. She knew which students would resist her and which ones would open up by week 3. She knew which questions would come and when. She knew which minds in this room were going to surprise her. And she knew which one, sitting quietly in the back row with 6 arms folded and 11,000 years of history behind him, was going to be the most surprised of all. She began to teach. 3 weeks passed. The station moved through its slow orbit above the gas giant, and the semester settled into its rhythm the way semesters always do. Slowly at first, and then all at once. Students learned each other's names or learned to avoid each other in the hallways, or found the particular corner of the cafeteria that felt least hostile to their biology. Papers were assigned, readings were uploaded. The artificial lights on the academic ring dimmed at the same time every night and came back bright at the same time every morning, and life continued the way it does in closed places, with small routines holding everything together. But outside the station, things were not routine at all. The coalition had been buzzing for months about a proposal that had finally been given its formal name, the Recalibration Accord. It had been designed by the Varath Dominion, circulated quietly among allied delegations, and drafted with the kind of clean, careful language that made deeply uncomfortable things sound reasonable. The accord proposed a restructuring of coalition voting rights, It used words like efficiency and proportional representation and civilizational maturity. What it meant, in plain terms, was this: humanity's 4 voting seats at the coalition governing table would be reduced to a purely advisory role. Humans would still attend sessions. They would still be heard. They just would not count. The argument was not without logic. Humans had only been members of the coalition for 40 years. 40 years was, to a species like the Varath, barely enough time to learn someone's name. The Varath had been navigating interstellar politics for longer than human civilization had existed. The Dosani, even with their complicated history, had shaped the political landscape of 2-star clusters. Compared to these species, humanity was a child sitting at a table full of adults, and the accord was a polite suggestion that children should listen more and vote less. Most of the coalition agreed, or was about to. The vote was scheduled in 60 days. Claire knew about the accord, of course. Everyone on the station knew. The 3 human students in her class knew. Kevin Marsh had stayed after class one evening and asked her directly what she thought about it. She had looked at him for a moment, the way she looked at students when she was deciding how honest to be, and then she had said, "I think it is exactly the kind of thing we have been studying," and she had left it at that. In class, she did not talk about the accord. She did not mention it once. Instead, she taught the fall of the Karath hegemony. The Karath were not a species that most of her students had studied in any detail. They were not famous the way the Varath were famous, or feared the way the Dosani had once been feared. They were, in the way of many fallen civilizations, remembered mostly as a footnote. But at their height, the Karath had controlled 40-star systems. They had a fleet that no rival could match, and a political system that had run without a major crisis for 600 years. They were, by any reasonable measure, successful. And then, in less than 300 years, they were gone. Not from war, not from plague, not from any single catastrophe that could be pointed at on a map or a timeline. They collapsed because they stopped asking questions. Specifically, and they stopped asking the questions that their own success made them feel were no longer necessary. They had built a civilization that worked, and so they assumed it would continue to work. And they organized everything around that assumption, and they never noticed, not once, in 3 centuries of slow decline, that the assumption had stopped being true. Claire put the data on the screen: timelines, resource curves, political records. She walked through it slowly, without drama. She did not tell her students what to think about it. She just laid it out piece by piece and let it sit there. The Varath students were quiet in a way that was different from their usual quiet. Their usual quiet was the quiet of people who already knew something. This was a different kind. This was the quiet of people who were trying to decide whether what they were looking at applied to them. She noticed. She said nothing. 2 days later, that she taught the Dosani near collapse of the 28th century. This was harder. The Dosani students knew their own history, of course, but there is a difference between knowing history and sitting in a room while a teacher from a species you have always considered minor walks you through the specific decisions your ancestors made that nearly ended your civilization. One of the Dosani students, a young woman named Sariva, sat very still during that entire lecture. Her harmonic hum, which usually ran low and constant under her breath, stopped completely. She watched Claire with the expression of someone watching a door open into a room they had always been told was empty. Claire did not look at Sariva directly. She taught the way she always taught, calmly and without cruelty, but with a precision that made the facts do the work that emotion would have done badly. And then she assigned the group projects. She paired students deliberately, across species lines, in combinations that she had thought about carefully. She put the Valesi students with 2 Gren, which created a communication challenge that would force both groups to find new methods. She put Diane Cole with one of the Dosani students, which she expected to produce friction, and from which she knew both of them would learn more than they would from anyone easier. And she put Kevin Marsh with Orveth Saul. Orveth Saul was the most senior of the Varath students, and he was young by Varath standards, barely 400 years old. But he had the bearing of someone who had never once been uncertain about his place in the order of things. He had submitted his first 2 assignments with the quiet confidence of a person who considered the work beneath him, but was too disciplined to show it openly. His writing was technically perfect. It was also, Claire had noted, completely safe. He never argued anything that had not already been argued, so he never took a position that carried any risk. Kevin, on the other hand, asked questions like someone who did not know which questions he was not supposed to ask. On their first meeting, Kevin had looked at the project brief and said simply, "I think the whole premise of the second section is set up wrong." And he had explained why, clearly, without apology, in the way that people explain things when they are not worried about being wrong because they are too busy trying to understand. That Orveth Saul had stared at him. He had not been challenged like that since, he tried to think of the last time, and he could not find the memory because it had not happened. Not from a student he considered a peer, not from someone from a 40-year-old civilization, not from a human who was barely older than the word hello in Orveth Saul's native language. He did not respond right away. He went back to his room and looked at the second section of the brief again. He read it 3 times. Then, very quietly, he began to see what Kevin had seen. Claire was across the station when this happened. She was at her desk, reading a paper from a previous student. She did not know the exact moment it occurred, but she knew it would. She had always known it would. She had put those 2 together precisely because she knew that an 11,000-year-old civilization and a 22-year-old kid from Ohio were going to run into each other like 2 currents in a river. And the result was not going to be what either of them expected. She kept reading. She made a note in the margin of the paper. Outside the window, the gas giant rolled slowly through the dark, enormous and patient, and completely indifferent to all of it. The semester continued. It was 40 days before the vote when Sariva stayed after class. The other students had filed out in their usual way. The Varath slowly, the Gren slowly for different reasons, the humans quickly. It's because humans always seemed to be going somewhere else, even when they were not. The room emptied down to its usual end-of-class quiet, which was the particular quiet of a space where people had been thinking hard for an hour, and the air still felt slightly heavy with it. Sariva stood near her seat. She did not move toward the door. She held her tablet against her chest with both hands and looked at Claire, and who was already clearing the display screen and making notes on her own device without appearing to be in any hurry. Claire looked up. She waited. Sariva said, "You are human." Claire said yes. Sariva said, "You know what the Accord will do. You know what will happen to humans in the coalition if the vote passes. Advisory role means nothing. You know that. Everyone knows that. And yet you are in here, teaching us, teaching the Dosani, teaching the Varath, teaching all of us, every day. And you have been doing it for years." She paused. "Why are you not angry?" The room was very quiet. Claire set down her tablet. She looked at Sariva for a long moment, the way she looked at questions that deserved a real answer instead of an easy one. Then she said, "I am angry." Sariva had not expected that. Claire said she had been angry since the day the Accord was first circulated. She said she had read every line of it, and that the anger she felt was the clean, sharp kind. Not the kind that clouds your thinking, but the kind that comes from seeing something clearly and not liking what you see. She said that kind of anger was information. It told you something true, but it was not, by itself, a strategy. It could not cast a vote. It could not change a mind. It could not do the thing that actually needed doing. Sariva asked what the thing that actually needed doing was. Claire picked up her tablet again. She said, "Come to class tomorrow." And she walked out. Sariva stood there for a moment in the empty room, looking at the blank display screen, feeling the particular frustration of someone who has asked a direct question and received something that was technically an answer, but felt like a door closing rather than opening. She did not know, could not have known, that Claire had given her more of the truth in that conversation than she had given almost any student in 11 years. What Claire had not said, but and would not say out loud to anyone, was the longer version of the answer. It was not a secret exactly. It was more like something that loses its shape when you put it into words too directly, the way some things are better understood by watching them than by being told about them. Claire had come to the Valerin Institute because she understood something that most humans in the Coalition's political offices did not. The Coalition was not going to be changed by human admirals or human ambassadors or human negotiators, no matter how skilled they were. Those were the visible levers of power, and the visible levers of power, in a coalition where humans were the youngest and smallest player, were already set against them. You could not out-argue the Varath on procedural grounds. You could not outmaneuver the Dasani in back-corridor politics. You could not show up to a game that had been running for thousands of years and expect to win it on your first few decades of trying. But there was another kind of power. It was slower. It was quieter. It did not show up in vote counts or fleet deployments or trade agreements. It was the power of shaping the way that the people who made those decisions thought. Not what they decided, but how they decided. Not the answers, but the questions they knew to ask. But she had been doing it for 11 years. Her former students were, by now, scattered across the Coalition in positions that would have surprised anyone who had not been paying careful attention. One of them, a Varath named Thesan Vol, who had sat in this same room 9 years ago with the same six-armed certainty as Orveth Sol, now sat on the Varath Judicial Council and had, in the past 3 years, quietly blocked 2 policy proposals that would have further marginalized younger Coalition species. Thesan Vol had never publicly connected those decisions to anything learned in a classroom. But Claire knew. She had read the written arguments. She recognized the framework. 2 Dasani students from 4 years ago were now policy architects in the Dasani home system. They wrote proposals with a historical awareness that was, by Dasani standards, unusual. And they cited civilizational collapse patterns. They asked questions about long-term structural risk. Their supervisors considered them thorough and a little overcautious. They were, in fact, thinking in a way they had been gently and patiently taught to think. One human student, a woman named Laura Finch, who had graduated 6 years ago, had helped draft a section of the Coalition's revised resource-sharing framework that was now considered a model of interspecies cooperation. Laura had done that not because she was the smartest person in the room during those negotiations, but because she was the only person in the room who had spent a semester learning to hold a mirror up to her own civilization's assumptions without flinching, and who therefore knew how to help others do the same. These were not famous outcomes. There were no ceremonies. No one had given Claire an award for any of it. And the Institute considered her a solid teacher with a good retention rate and above-average student reviews. Her department head thought she was a little quiet at staff meetings. She was fine with all of that. In the classroom, the work continued. Kevin and Orveth Sayal had submitted their first section, and it was, Claire noted when she read it, the most interesting thing Orveth Sayal had written since arriving at the Institute. It was not perfect, but it was alive in a way that his earlier work had not been. There were moments in it where you could feel 2 very different kinds of thinking pressing against each other, creating a friction that produced something neither one of them would have produced alone. She wrote one comment at the bottom. "This is better. Keep pressing each other." Sariva came to class the next day, and the day after that, and every day for the rest of the semester. She sat in the same seat. She took notes in the same careful, precise way. But something had changed in the way she listened. It was not obvious from the outside, but Claire noticed it, the way she noticed everything in that room. Sariva had stopped waiting for the lesson to end. She had started waiting to see what came next. Claire did not point this out. She did not reward it. She just kept teaching, the same way she always had. Clearly, patiently, without drama. Asking questions that opened doors and then standing back and waiting to see who was willing to walk through them. Outside, the countdown to the vote continued. Inside room 14C, the pens kept moving. The day of the vote arrived the way important days often do. Quietly, and without the dramatic weight that people had been building around it for months. The gas giant below the station looked the same as it always did. The lights on the academic ring came on at the same time. That the cafeteria served its usual bad breakfast. Students moved through the hallways with the restless energy of people who knew something large was happening somewhere else and were not sure whether to feel part of it or apart from it. The coalition governing chamber was not on the Valerin Institute. It was 3 systems away, on the neutral platform called Meridian Station, where the large political machinery of 41 member species met to argue and decide and occasionally, in the long view of history, to actually get something right. But the vote was broadcast on every coalition network, and there were screens in the Institute's common rooms, and small groups of students and staff gathered around them in the way people gather when they know something is going to be decided that they cannot control. The human students watched together. Kevin sat with Diane and Pete in the common room near the residential ring, their breakfast trays pushed to the side, not eating. Kevin had his hands folded in his lap. He was not saying anything. None of them were. The chamber filled on screen. The delegations took their places. The Varath sat in their section with the composed stillness of people who already knew how a story ended because they had written it. Their lead delegate, a senior official named Vorath Sen, arranged his materials with precise, unhurried movements. The math was known to everyone. 41 seats, 4 human votes, which would be reduced to 0 in any binding sense. The Varath had secured 22 commitment pledges from other delegations over the previous weeks. 6 more were considered likely. The accord would pass with room to spare. The human delegation sat in their 4 seats and looked like what they were. A small group of people in a very large room where the numbers were not going to work in their favor. The session opened. Vorath Sen presented the accord. He did it well, methodically, clearly, with the kind of practiced calm that comes from a civilization that has been making formal arguments for 10,000 years. He cited proportional contribution metrics. He cited civilizational age indices. He cited 3 previous coalition restructurings that had, he said, strengthened the body by aligning voting weight with demonstrated historical capacity. He did not say that humans were inferior. He said very carefully that all species developed at their own pace, and that the coalition's governing structure should reflect that reality. It sounded almost reasonable. The response period began. Several delegations spoke in support. 2 raised mild concerns about process, but not principle. The human delegation gave their formal objection, which was clear and well argued and, in the room as it currently stood, insufficient. Then the Dosani delegation requested the floor. This was not on the agenda. The Dosani had not been listed as a responding party, and they had not, as far as any political observer tracking the accord's progress had noted, shown any sign of breaking from their expected pattern, which was quiet non-commitment followed by abstention. The Dasani did not take strong positions on internal coalition restructuring. They never had. It was not their way. First Architect Doran stood up. He was Sariva's father, though no one in the broadcast audience would have known that or considered it relevant. He was a large, a sharp-featured man who moved with the deliberate economy of someone who understood that every gesture in a formal chamber carried weight. He had been in Dosani politics for over 60 years. He was not known for surprises. What he delivered was not a speech in the emotional sense. It was not a plea. It was not a passionate defense of humanity. It was a precise, structured, historically grounded argument, the kind that takes a long time to build and a long time to answer, about the structural dangers of reducing any member species to non-binding status. He argued that every time a coalition predecessor body had made a similar move, for similar reasons, the long-term result had not been greater efficiency. It had been a slow reduction in the body's ability to respond to novel problems, because you had removed the voices most likely to ask questions that everyone else had already decided were settled. He used specific examples. He cited the collapse patterns of 3 pre-coalition multi-species bodies. He traced the structural similarities to the current proposal with a precision that was, to anyone who had spent a semester studying exactly those patterns, unmistakably familiar. In the observation gallery above the chamber floor, a young coalition aide named Aaron Cole sat with a group of other junior analysts and watched the screen relaying the chamber proceedings. Aaron had graduated from the Valerin Institute 5 years ago. He was 27 now, quiet and careful in the way that people become when they are good at their jobs, but not yet senior enough to say so. He had taken Claire's course in his 2nd year. He had thought at the time that it was interesting but not immediately useful, and he was revising that opinion in real time. He watched Doran speak. He listened to the examples. He heard the framework underneath the argument, not loudly, not announced, but present, like a structure holding up a wall that looked like it was standing on its own. He had seen that structure before. He had a notebook on his tablet that was 5 years old and contained lecture notes that used the same architecture. He did not pull the notebook out. He just watched. And 2 more delegations spoke after Doran. A Valesi delegate cited similar historical concerns. A representative from the Gren Alliance, in their slow and careful way, raised questions about long-term coalition diversity and resilience. Neither of them had coordinated with the Dosani formally, but both arguments moved along the same lines, in the same direction, like tributaries finding the same river. The vote was called. The tally board filled from the top. Commitment pledges began to break. 3 delegations that had been marked as supporting the accord recorded abstentions, 2 recorded votes against. By the time the count reached its final lines, the math that had seemed so clean and settled for weeks had shifted into something nobody in the chamber had modeled. The accord failed. By 6 votes. The Vareth delegation was very still. Vorath Sen's expression did not change, because Vareth expressions rarely did. But the stillness was a different kind than the one from before the vote. In the common room on the station's residential ring, Kevin let out a long, slow breath. Diane made a sound that was not quite a word. Pete stared at the screen for a moment and then looked at his untouched breakfast like he had forgotten it existed. Aaron Cole closed his analysis tablet in the observation gallery. He sat for a moment in the noise of other people's reactions around him. Then he opened an old folder on his personal device and found his notes from 5 years ago. He scrolled to a line he had underlined during his 2nd week of Claire's class. He read it once. He closed the folder. He did not send her a message. He thought about it. He decided she probably already knew. Down in room 14C, 3 systems away, the display screen was dark. The chairs were empty. The semester still had 3 weeks left. The room was waiting, the way good rooms wait, without impatience, without urgency, simply ready for the next morning when the door would open and the work would continue. The semester ended on a Tuesday. Grades were submitted. The Institute's administrative system confirmed receipts. The academic ring grew quieter over the course of 3 days as students packed their belongings, said their goodbyes, and began the process of returning to wherever they had come from, other stations, other planets, and home systems that some of them had not seen in nearly a year. The common rooms emptied. The cafeteria, which had always been noisy in the mornings, became the kind of quiet that only happens in places that are built for crowds and suddenly find themselves without them. The gas giant below continued its slow, enormous orbit, indifferent as always. Claire stayed. She always stayed. She used the weeks between semesters to read, to review her course material, and to think about what had worked and what had not. She walked the empty corridors in the evenings and ate her meals alone without minding it. She had made peace, long ago, with the particular solitude of a person whose most important relationships happen in classrooms and then end on a scheduled date. The final papers came in during the last 2 days of the semester, as they always did, the bulk of them arriving in a rush in the final hours before the deadline. Now, because students across all species shared, at least, the universal tendency to leave things until the last possible moment. Orveth Sal submitted his 3 days late. This was notable for a number of reasons, the most significant being that in recorded Vareth academic history, a late submission from a student of Orveth Sal's lineage was essentially unheard of. The Vareth were many things, but they were never late. Promptness was, for them, a matter of something close to cultural identity, and it was the kind of thing that, in Vareth society, people simply did not do. Orveth Sal did it. There was a short personal note attached to the paper, which was also unusual. It said, in plain language, that he had needed more time than expected because the paper he had originally planned to write had stopped feeling true about halfway through, and he had had to start again. He apologized for the delay. He said he hoped the final version justified it. Claire read the note first. Then she read the paper. It was the best thing he had written since arriving at the Institute. It was, in her considered judgment, one of the best student papers she had received in 11 years of teaching the course. It was a careful, honest, deeply researched analysis of Vareth civilizational assumptions and the structural vulnerabilities those assumptions had been quietly building for the last 2,000 years. It did not say the Vareth were wrong. It asked, with rigorous precision, what it would look like if they were, and what evidence would tell you the difference. It was brave in the way that only real intellectual honesty is brave, not dramatic, not loud, but willing to look directly at something uncomfortable and not look away. She wrote one line of feedback at the bottom. Now you are asking the right questions. She submitted his grade. The late penalty applied, as it always did, because rules were rules and she did not make exceptions. But the grade, even with the penalty, was the highest in the class. Kevin Marsh got a job offer before he had finished packing his room. It came from a coalition joint research body, a relatively new organization that worked on interspecies resource and knowledge-sharing projects and had a reputation for doing difficult, unglamorous work quietly and well. The offer was specific. They wanted Kevin for a collaborative project that would involve working alongside a team that included 3 Vareth scientists. The offer letter cited his academic record and his project work from the semester. It did not cite anything else. Kevin accepted. He told Diane about it in the hallway while they were both carrying bags toward the transport dock. She said congratulations and meant it. He said he had no idea why they had asked for him specifically, out of all the students in the Institute's graduating cohort. He did not think to wonder whether anyone had quietly pointed them in his direction, and he simply felt lucky and grateful and ready. Claire, who had made one short, informal communication to a contact at the research body 3 weeks earlier, read the acceptance confirmation on her tablet and set it face down on her desk without particular ceremony. She had work to do. Sariva's message arrived 6 months later. It was short, maybe 4 sentences. Sariva had returned to the Dosani home system and entered the policy track. Which was what her family had always expected her to do and what she had always expected of herself. though the reasons had shifted somewhat since she had sat in room 14C. She was working on a long-term coalition engagement proposal and finding it harder than she expected. Not the work itself, but the questions she kept feeling obligated to ask about the work, questions that slowed things down and annoyed her colleagues, and would not, she found, go away no matter how inconvenient they were. And she said she was still unsatisfied with the answer Claire had given her that afternoon after class, when she had asked why Claire was not angry. She said she thought that was probably the point. She said, "Thank you." Claire read the message twice. She filed it in the same folder where she kept the others, the quiet notes that arrived occasionally from former students who had found themselves in some moment that connected back to something learned in a room orbiting a gas giant. And the folder was not large. Most people did not write. Most of the time, Claire did not need them to. The new semester began on a Monday. 21 new students, 7 species. The chairs filled in the same pattern they always did. The most confident species in the back rows, the quieter ones in the middle, the humans near the front. New faces, new names that Claire was already learning. I knew combinations of certainty and assumption, and the particular kind of arrogance that comes from belonging to a civilization old enough to believe it has figured out the important things. She set the display screen. She let the room settle. The single line of text appeared. Why every dominant civilization in recorded history believed it had already won. She let them read it. She watched their faces. She already knew which ones would resist, which ones would open up, which ones would surprise themselves by week 4. She already knew which 2 students she would pair together and why, and what the friction between them would produce. She already knew the moment, around week 6, when the lesson that nobody in the room thought they were taking would begin to quietly take hold. She had done this 12 times now. She knew how it ended. She began to speak. And somewhere in the room, slowly at first, then all at once, pens began to move.